Scotland has spawned a few serial killers over the years. There was Peter Manuel in the 1950s, who was convicted of murdering 7 people. There's the infamous Bible John, who may have killed 3 women in the 60s, with Bible John to date not having been identified. There was Dennis Nilsen, who was convicted of murdering 6 men and boys and attempting to murder 2 others, although there was every possibility he actually murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983 in London. There was Angus Sinclair, who was convicted of murdering a 7-year-old girl in the 60s and 2 17-year-old girls in 1977. There was Ian Brady, who along with Myra Hindley were convicted of murdering 3 of 5 children who were murdered in the 60s. There was Peter Tobin, who was convicted of murdering 3 people between 1991 and 2006, although he stated that he may have had as many as 48 victims, and it was also speculated if he could have been Bible John. There was Archibald Hall, who committed several murders of British aristocrats while he worked as a butler in the 1970s. And there was Robert Black, who was convicted of murdering 4 girls between the ages of 5 and 11 between 1981 and 1986. And in 1998, following a 7th woman being found murdered in Glasgow in the 90s, many felt there may have been yet another serial killer walking the streets of Glasgow. However, despite some of the murders being potentially linked to other murders in England, and English and Scottish police forces working together to try and determine if a serial killer was at work due to the similarities in many of the murders, police detectives in Glasgow continued to state that there definitely was no link between the deaths. But if the many Scottish and English murders of women were not in fact linked, then was that maybe even scarier? That instead of there being just one serial killer out there that had now taken the lives of 7 women in Scotland and countless others in England, that in fact there may have been many murderers. And then in April 2005, yet another Scottish woman was found murdered. Would this finally lead to the man or men who had taken the lives of so many vulnerable women in Scotland and England being caught? Diane McAnally grew up in Castlemilk in Glasgow, about 7.4 miles or 11.9 kilometres from Glasgow city centre, with her mum Lynn, stepdad John, sister Angela and brother Stephen, with Diane's mum Lynn and her dad Roger being separated. Diane became pregnant in 1985 at the age of 17, giving birth to a son who she and her partner called Craig. However, shortly after the birth of her son, Diane and her partner split up. And it was at this point Diane began taking drugs, becoming addicted to heroin, and eventually moved to the Gorbals area of Glasgow, located 2 miles or 3.9 kilometres south of Glasgow city centre, which was a densely populated area with many people residing in the numerous flat tower blocks built there to house a growing population. However, despite becoming addicted to drugs, which her family did know about and did try to help her, according to her Aunt Dolly, Diane still continued to be a loving and caring mum, and she would still ensure that her son was well looked after. She would continue to get him ready for school in the mornings and make sure he got there, and then collect him from school in the afternoons, making sure he had a good tea. However, by 1991, this routine had changed slightly, in that after 23-year-old Diane had given her son his evening meal, she would then take him to her mother's house for her to look after him, while Diane went to work on the streets of Glasgow, needing the money to continue to feed her habit, as well as take care of her son as best she could. And Tuesday, the 15th of October 1991, was no different. Diane took her son to her mother's house for the night, where she said bye to her mum, stepdad and son, before making her way to work the cold streets of Glasgow city centre's red light district, known as the Drag. On the night of the 15th of October 1991, Diane was last seen getting into a car on the Drag, and her strangled and beaten body was found the next day by a dog walker in woods on the Pollock Park grounds. 4.9 miles or 7.9 kilometres southwest of where she had last been seen, behind the Burrell Collection Art Museum, which had opened 8 years prior and had fast become world famous for the collection. Pollock Park was also a popular place for sex workers and their clients, as it was a quiet and very large area. Diane had been severely beaten, believing to have been beaten with a baseball bat. So severely, in fact, about her face that she was unrecognisable and could only be identified by her fingerprints, and it was believed that Diane had been killed where she had been found. While a large number of police officers, led by Detective Superintendent Joe Jackson, descended on the red light district at the beginning of the murder inquiry to speak to Diane's fellow sex workers in the hope of gleaning information about who could have killed Diane, it was quickly realised that those who were working on the streets of Glasgow alongside Diane were also addicted to drugs, and many, having had bad experiences with police officers before, were either not willing to speak to police officers, or would give false names and addresses if they did, or sadly they just couldn't remember anything, with their thoughts having only been focused the previous evening on getting their next fix. And Detective Joe Jackson said that this murder inquiry had been one of the most difficult he had ever worked on, especially as there were no forensics found at the scene due to it having rained and likely washed any evidence away. However, Joe Jackson was diligent and determined to get as much information as possible about Diane's possible killer, and so he first enlisted the help of a hypnotist to try and help one particular sex worker remember any details from the evening of Diane's murder. Sadly, this didn't lead anywhere though. Meanwhile, officers had been searching through the limited CCTV footage that was available to try and track down Diane's movements the evening she went missing. And footage was found of Diane leaving her tower block in the Gorbals about 9 p.m. and heading to the red light district, and then last being seen getting into a car later that evening. With Christmas fast approaching and detectives hitting a brick wall in the murder inquiry, officers had been checking CCTV footage from the days and weeks following and after Diane's murder, and had eventually been able to gather 300 car registration numbers of men who had frequently been seen in the red light district. Knowing that there was no way his officers could possibly visit every address on the list to question the car owners, Detective Joe Jackson decided to make an appeal to every male driver who had frequented the red light district on the run-up to and after Diane's murder, and especially if they were customers of Diane, to come forward to be questioned about their whereabouts. But Joe Jackson added the threat that if the men whose names they had from CCTV footage did not come forward immediately, they would be visited at home over the festive period to be questioned in front of their family members. Needless to say, this threat worked, and about 500 men turned up at the police station, all desperately trying to hide their faces as they arrived and waited to be interviewed. Those in attendance included at least one police officer, 2 ministers, 3 priests, and a sheriff. However, despite the large amount of men who had come forward and been interviewed, and there being at this point more than 1,000 statements having been taken, there still was no solid lead on Diane's killer. Although it was noted that a couple of names had begun to be mentioned in statements a few times, as well as a few possible theories of the motive to Diane's murder had emerged. It was reported in an article in the Glasgow Times on the 31st of March 2021 that the detective leading the murder inquiry, Detective Superintendent Joe Jackson, said that Diane was no angel, but she was also a young mother who loved her child, and that she didn't deserve to die. The detective, who in 2021 was retired, was referring to the fact that it appeared that Diane was not only taking drugs herself, but was also selling them to other sex workers, a supply she herself had gotten from 2 drug dealers, 20-year-old Dale Daga Clark and 28-year-old Gary Moore, the 2 names that had repeatedly come up in many of the statements police had taken, with it being reported by some who knew Diane that apparently Diane had owed both Daga and Gary money for the drugs she had sold, but instead she had spent the money she owed them on more drugs for herself. Although others reported, according to the Daily Record on the 13th of March 2016, that Diane had possibly been murdered not because she owed drugs money, but to be silenced because she had apparently agreed to be a key prosecution witness against a man suspected of being involved in a major drugs operation. However, another theory was that she had again been silenced, but this time because she had witnessed a gangster murder someone and they had to get rid of her before she talked about it. Whichever theory was correct, if any, months had now passed and all lines of inquiry had been ruled out, and so the two men whose names had come up frequently in statements needed to be investigated too. And so, with both men being known to the police, Daga as a drug dealer and Gary Moore as a violent man, they were both brought in for questioning on multiple occasions. However, neither man would or could tell the police anything about Diane's murder. Despite this, though, and despite there being no forensic evidence, in March 1992, 5 months after Diane's murder, gangland enforcer Gary Moore and drug dealer Dale Daga Clark were charged with Diane's murder, as Joe Jackson believed they had a strong, if only circumstantial, case against both men. And then both men were released again without charge the very next day. As to what happened to the strong case that Joe Jackson believed they had against the men, Joe Jackson himself did not fully understand, but he would go on to share his thoughts on this matter at a later date. However, apparently the strong circumstantial evidence was presented to the Procurator Fiscal, who agreed that yes, there was a strong circumstantial case that could see both men go to trial for Diane's murder, and so on this basis both men were charged. However, the next day, when both Daga and Gary appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court, the very same Procurator Fiscal had changed his mind, saying there was now not a strong case to enable both men to go to trial, and therefore they were both released without charge, leaving the murder inquiry to slip from people's minds and go cold. That was until April 1993, 16 months after Diane's murder, when the almost naked and strangled body of 26-year-old Karen McGregor was found. Sadly, not much is known about Karen's life before she was murdered, other than she lived with her unemployed drug addict husband, 28-year-old Charles, at Tall Cross in Glasgow, about 4.5 miles or 7.2 kilometres from Glasgow city centre. Karen was also a mother to her 2 young children, 4-year-old Stephanie and 2-year-old Jamie, and she came from a respectable, law-abiding family. Karen also had a heroin addiction and worked on the Glasgow streets, known as the Drag, as a sex worker to feed both her own and her husband's drug habit. And that was what she had been doing on the night of Saturday the 17th of April 1993, working on the Drag to desperately earn the money she needed for herself and her husband, despite the danger she was putting herself in. And sadly, on Monday the 19th of April, Karen's body was found in bushes at one of the car parks for the Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre in Glasgow, now known as the SEC, about 1.5 miles or 2.4 kilometres from the Drag and yards from the River Clyde. Karen had only been left wearing her tights, which according to an article in the Glasgow Times had £73 or $95 in the left sole, and the remains of a choker around her neck. The other part of the choker was found about 50 yards from Karen's body, and it appeared that she had been dragged through bushes. Almost immediately, police shut down any links between Karen's murder and the murder of Diane 16 months earlier, despite the similarities, and almost instantly they believed that Karen had likely been killed by one of her clients. However, despite this, the beginnings of murmurings about there possibly being a serial killer targeting Glasgow sex workers began. As the police began an investigation into Karen's murder, they quickly realised that, despite them firmly believing that Karen had been murdered by one of her clients, this theory was not going to be an easy one to prove. Firstly, there was very little found at the scene that could help the police, and while where Karen was found was a popular place for sex workers to bring their clients, from the sex workers that would talk to the police, nobody had seen anyone arrive or leave the area where Karen had been found. And at the time, CCTV systems were not operating in that area of the city, so the police were not able to compile a list of car registration numbers that had been in the area and make an appeal, as in Diane's murder inquiry, for them to come forward. Karen's sick mum, who was actually in hospital at the time of her daughter's murder, also issued an emotional appeal for anyone with information to please come forward, as did Karen's husband Charles, where he pleaded, "Find my wife's killer." But again, no one came forward with any information. It was in August 1993 that, despite the detectives investigating Karen's murder continuing to be adamant that there were no links between Diane and Karen's murders and that both women had been killed by different men, that the murmurings about a serial killer possibly stalking sex workers began again, as, according to an article in the Herald newspaper on the 2nd of August 1993, there were startling similarities between the murders of Karen McGregor and Diane McAnally and two other recent unsolved murders of sex workers in England, and that police were not ruling out that Karen's murder especially fitted the pattern of the killings of the sex workers in England, and that officers from Scottish and English police forces had been liaising regarding the similarities and potential links. But then, in the same breath, the police were also saying that they were not looking for a serial killer at this time. So, a bit contradictory. Perhaps they didn't want to instill fear and panic in people. However, despite Scottish and English police forces working together, as the months since Karen had been murdered continued to pass, police were no further forward in catching her killer. That was until October 1993, 6 months after Karen's body had been found, when her husband, Charles, was arrested and charged with punching and striking 26-year-old Karen with a hard object, of compressing her throat and murdering her, after police received statements pertaining to Karen's murder from 3 separate witnesses: 21-year-old Joseph McGinty, Samuel Main, and Derek McNaught. The murder trial began in February 1994, and it was revealed that it wasn't until 21-year-old drug addict Joseph McGinty was arrested 6 months after Karen's murder for another crime that he made 5 separate statements implicating Charles McGregor in Karen's murder, with Charles's counsel stating at the trial, according to the Herald newspaper on the 8th of February 1994, that Joseph McGinty had used his vivid imagination to make up lies about the unsolved murder of Karen, so he could do a deal with the police to get out of his current predicament. From the statements made by the 3 men, it was surmised that Karen and Charles had had a disagreement on Saturday the 17th of April 1993, before Karen then left their home to go and work on the streets of Glasgow to make money for their drug habit. However, upon Karen returning home in the early hours of Sunday the 18th of April, she had been attacked by her husband, and apparently this was witnessed by Samuel Main and Derek McNaught, where Charles had punched and hit Karen repeatedly with a hammer before compressing her throat and killing her. He then apparently left Karen's body lying on the couch. And it was on Sunday morning when Joseph McGinty apparently called at Charles and Karen's property to see Charles that he claimed to have seen Karen lying on the couch dead with severe facial injuries, although there was no sign at all of Charles. However, according to Samuel and Derek's statements to the police, Charles had then supposedly come up with a plan that in order to make Karen's murder seem like it had been caused by one of her clients, Charles had wrapped his wife's body up in a sheet, placed her in the back of his car before dumping her body in bushes near the exhibition centre and then removing the blanket he had wrapped her in. Joseph McGinty also stated that at Karen's funeral, as he was standing at her graveside with Charles McGregor, he said he had heard him saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it," with the prosecution telling the jury that they could take this to mean that he hadn't meant to kill her. However, when Samuel Main and Derek McNaught took to the stand to give their evidence at the trial, they both claimed that they had made the whole story up, following pressure from the police, with Samuel Main saying that he would rather face 5 years for perjury than continue with a lie that could put Charles McGregor in prison for a murder he did not commit. So now there was only Joseph McGinty's witness testimony, which Charles's defence counsel soon made short work of when he addressed the jurors and said, according to an article in the Glasgow Times, that it was a quantum leap to believe that drug addict Charles had dreamt up this plot after killing his wife that would make everyone else think that she'd been killed by one of her clients. And if he had indeed killed her and always needed money for drugs, then why would he have left £73 or $95 in her tights? He also suggested that if Charles had said, "I did not mean it," at Karen's graveside, this could have meant absolutely anything. There was nothing to prove that he had taken Karen's life. And also, why had Joseph McGinty only come forward with the fact he had seen Karen's body dead on her couch on Sunday the 18th of April at the time? Why wait to tell this story until he had been arrested and needed to come up with a way out of his situation? The jury were then asked to disregard Joseph's evidence, as without this pack of lies, there was absolutely no proof that Charles McGregor had killed Karen. At this point, Joseph McGinty was described by Judge Lord McCluskey, according to the Herald newspaper, on the 9th of February 1994, as a master of fiction. After a 13-day trial, the jury retired and took only 3 hours to return a verdict of not proven. At which point, Karen's mum, who had attended the trial every day, slumped back in her wheelchair. But friends of Karen were not so subdued, with one female friend shouting at Charles McGregor as he was ushered out of the courtroom, "You murdering bastard, you're going to get it." And just like that, the hopes of receiving justice for Karen McGregor and the police proving that there likely wasn't a serial killer at work, the police's hopes fell flat. At this time, despite the similarities in the murders of Diane and Karen, the police continued to believe and state that there was not a serial killer at work and that different people had been responsible for Diane and Karen's murders, despite there apparently being not enough evidence to bring 2 men to trial for Diane's murder and Karen's husband Charles receiving a not proven verdict. However, would their beliefs change when a third woman, 22-year-old Leona McGovern, was found murdered in June 1995, 2 years after Karen McGregor's murder? Now, I mentioned before that detectives had found it difficult to investigate Karen's murder due to them not being able to access CCTV footage of possible people Karen may have been with on that evening due to CCTV cameras not being in the area where she had been found. Well, sadly, this was likely a deliberate move, as sex workers back in the 90s were not looked on favourably by many, including police officers. And so it appeared that due to trying to remain away from the watchful and disapproving eyes of police officers, sex workers, including 22-year-old Leona McGovern, were putting themselves at increasing risk by, instead of staying on the main drag, they were conducting their business away from security cameras on Washington Street instead, which was located a 10-minute walk away. But Leona thought she had a good plan, a plan that made her feel safer conducting her business in the shadows. Leona was from Hag Hill in Glasgow, about 3.2 miles or 5.1 kilometres east of Glasgow city centre. Again, sadly, there is very little known about Leona McGovern, other than she was 22 years old, she was addicted to heroin, and she was a sex worker. However, Leona and many of the sex workers were aware of the murders of Diane and Karen, and so knowing just how dangerous their job was, they began to put in place some measures that they felt made what they did ever so slightly safer. Leona and 2 other sex workers, also addicted to heroin, enlisted the help, if you could call it that, of a homeless thug to kind of look out for them. According to an article in the Daily Record on the 6th of June 1995, after Leona and the other 2 girls were dropped off by their clients, they would hand over the money they'd made to this homeless thug, and he in turn would note down the registration numbers of the cars that each of the girls got into. Later in the evening, the girls would go with this man, who was also addicted to heroin, and the money the girls had handed over to him that evening would be spent on heroin for the girls, this man, and his friends. Doesn't sound like much of a deal, but it made Leona and the other girls feel a bit protected. But despite this protection arrangement, on Friday the 2nd of June 1995, the body of 22-year-old Leona McGovern was found on the grounds of the then Strathclyde Art Centre, located on Washington Street, the very street sex workers were relocating to try and stay away from cameras. Leona had been stabbed 17 times in the head and neck and had been strangled, with a belt found still around her neck. However, despite there being no CCTV in the area where Leona's body had been found, there were witnesses. A security guard had been making his way home following his shift when he saw a man across the road from him repeatedly stabbing at something on the ground, right where Leona's body was later found. The security guard didn't think too much about this at the time, but upon hearing an appeal for information following Leona's body being found, he immediately came forward and gave a description of the man he had seen. He said, according to an article in the Daily Record on the 5th of June 1995, that the man was probably in his early 30s, with mousy brown hair, and had been dressed in denim. The net began to close further in on this man when one of Leona's friends said in the same article that she and the police believed that Leona's murderer would have been someone she knew and trusted, going on to say that, "I don't think a punter will have done this. It sounds more like a dealer or someone she's crossed or done the dirty on, a dealer or a junkie living off her back." Other witnesses came forward to say that they had seen a man matching this description running from the area where Leona had been found, and so the hunt was on. The police were given a number of names of who this man could be, and brought these men in for questioning and to investigate their alibis before they eventually found their man, less than 3 months after Leona had been murdered, when a witness placed a man at the scene. And it would appear that Leona's friend had been right. She had known her murderer. 31-year-old George Walker, of no fixed abode, but had been staying at a hostel located a 5-minute walk away from where Leona's body was found, was charged with Leona McGovern's murder on the 29th of August 1995, which he denied, and the 2-week murder trial took place in January 1996. The prosecution stated at the trial that Leona had owed George Walker £30 or $38, which he needed to fund his drug habit, but that she had refused to pay this money to him, and so he had murdered her. This was backed up by 36-year-old Patrick Haggerty, who had shared a prison cell with George Walker while he was on remand for murdering Leona, who testified that George Walker had confessed to murdering Leona, describing to him in detail how he had placed a belt around Leona's neck before stabbing her 17 times around the head and neck with a screwdriver, with Patrick going on to say that George had offered to take his belt off and show him exactly how he had done it, to which Patrick declined. Patrick went on to say that he believed that George Walker had absolutely murdered Leona and that he thought he was a bit of a psychopath. When asked if George had given a reason as to why he had murdered Leona, Patrick said he told him it was because she owed him money, ending his testimony by shouting, according to the Daily Record on the 29th of December 1995, "The man is a danger. You can't let him out onto the streets." Witnesses also appeared on the stand who testified having seen George Walker in the area where Leona had been found. However, George Walker's defence team came out fighting when they produced during the trial the name of another man who they claimed was actually Leona's murderer, a fact that this man strongly denied. Another person to take to the stand was a professor of forensic science, who apparently said, according to the Herald on the 10th of January 1996, that whoever killed Leona McGovern was probably only trying to disfigure her and had not intended to actually murder her. I'm not sure if he appeared as a witness for the defence or the prosecution, and I'm not sure if he helped either's case. But maybe he was there to help the defence, as later that same day, after a 2-week trial, and after only 90 minutes of deliberating, the jury returned with a majority not guilty verdict. Leona's friends and family, who were present in the courtroom for the verdict, erupted in anger, with one man shouting, "You're a dead man," and a woman screaming, "Animal," at George Walker before they were told to leave the courtroom. However, they waited outside the courthouse, along with many other relatives and friends of Leona's, for George Walker to show himself, and when he did, they tried to attack him, running after him as he fled to a waiting taxi. After the trial, George Walker's solicitor said he believed that the wrong man had been in the dock, and that the jury had obviously recognised this by returning the not guilty verdict. Utterly deflated, a senior detective, when asked if they would be investigating the man whose name had been put forward by the defence, replied, "The man named by the defence was investigated by us and eliminated from our inquiries. We do not intend looking at him again." However, it would be revealed years later that there had been another man who had been investigated and questioned by the police in 1993 about the murder of Leona McGovern, and another Glasgow sex worker who had been murdered, who I'll tell you about later. And this man had not only admitted trawling Glasgow's red light district, but that he had also had sex on 3 or 4 occasions with Angelica Cluck, who I mentioned in our Bible John episode, who had been murdered by Peter Tobin. More about that later though, as it wouldn't be long before the body of another Glasgow sex worker was found, this time in slightly different circumstances than Diane, Karen and Leona. But was this a desperately sad accident, or was this yet another murder of a Glasgow sex worker? Marjorie, or Madge, Roberts' life, in the months before she was found dead, had not turned out how she had expected at all. Marjorie and her partner had been happy for a while. They had 3 beautiful children, and both Marjorie and her partner were in employment. They weren't well off, but they were comfortable, and life was good. Then Marjorie and her partner split up, leaving Marjorie to bring up 3 young children alone. To add to this immense pressure, Marjorie then was made redundant from her job as a machinist, and she was unable to find another job, however much she tried. And slowly, Marjorie's life began to spiral out of control. She had no money and couldn't find a job. She could no longer provide for her children. She could no longer pay bills, and she was in fear of losing the roof over their heads. And so Marjorie turned desperately to the only thing she could think of doing to get some badly needed money, despite the awful fear many sex workers were feeling following the murders of 3 other sex workers. But Marjorie felt she had no other choice, and so she too began to work on the streets of Glasgow, and before long she had also begun taking drugs. 34-year-old Marjorie Roberts' body was found in August 1995, floating in the River Clyde near the Jamaica Bridge, which is now known as the Glasgow Bridge. But the question on everyone's lips, including police officers, was, did she fall or was she pushed? Well, unhelpfully, Marjorie's post-mortem found no bruises or marks on her body. However, as there had been a spate of sex worker murders in Glasgow, the police were keeping an open mind and began investigating Marjorie's death, leaving no stone unturned. Following reviewing CCTV camera footage, which was thankfully available from the area, they were able to trace Marjorie's movements the evening before, and they saw her with a man on the Broomy Law, which is about a 6-minute walk away from where her body was found. This was the last time Marjorie was seen alive. And so the police sought and found this man, bringing him in for questioning, and he quickly became their main focus. While this man was being questioned, the police, still keeping an open mind as to how Marjorie may have died, began to speak to Marjorie's family to try and get a better picture of her. During this time, the police asked if it would have been possible that Marjorie would have willingly gone into the water, to which Marjorie's sister Elizabeth replied that her sister would absolutely not willingly have gone into the water. In fact, she hated water and would not even put her head near water even when she was having a bath, with Elizabeth continuing by saying, according to the Herald newspaper on the 14th of June 2015, that there's no way Madge would have gone into the river. There's no way she would have left her family, especially not her children. With Marjorie's sister being so adamant that Marjorie had been pushed, not willingly having gone into the river, the police again focused their attention on the man she had last been seen alive with. However, with no evidence and this man not admitting anything, the police released him without charges, saying that they just couldn't prove either way whether Marjorie had slipped and fallen or had been pushed. A fact that Marjorie's family just couldn't understand, especially when it was revealed that, despite this man being seen with Marjorie, and the last person to see her alive, he initially denied knowing her, although he did later change his story and admitted that yes, he had actually known Marjorie. It was also revealed that following this man telling police officers his movements on the night Marjorie was murdered, including timings, the police had actually gone and retraced his steps and concluded, according to an article in the Herald on the 14th of June 2015, that his version of events and the time the walk took didn't match up with what the police found out. It was also revealed that despite police divers searching the River Clyde, Marjorie's handbag was never found, and it never washed up anywhere along the Clyde either. Had Marjorie's killer, if she was killed, taken her handbag as a souvenir? Incredibly, according to the Glasgow Times on the 4th of June 2015, weeks after Marjorie's body had been found, the same man who she had last been seen with was accused of trying to push another sex worker into the River Clyde. Thankfully, this woman managed to escape and flagged down a passing taxi, but she didn't want to take any further action against this man. Was this just an awful coincidence, or signs of a pattern? Following Marjorie's death and no charges being brought against anyone, her sister Elizabeth spent time with sex workers in the area trying to glean any information about Marjorie's death. And she found out that the very same man who had last been seen with Marjorie and who had tried to push another sex worker into the River Clyde weeks after Marjorie's death was a well-known customer to the other sex workers. He was known, according to a Herald article, for being rough and violent, with one sex worker apparently saying that he had no respect for women, and he made that perfectly clear. It was reported in the Herald newspaper on the 10th of January 1996, 5 months after Marjorie had been found dead, that a report on the death of Marjorie Roberts was with the Procurator Fiscal Office. But would the police have enough evidence to prove that Marjorie had indeed been murdered? Enough evidence that the Procurator Fiscal would be confident to issue an arrest and to agree to a trial going ahead? We'll find out later in the story, because sadly in June 1996, just under a year since Marjorie's body had been found, a fifth Glasgow sex worker was found murdered. It was actually a case suggestion from Megan Grant that led me to finding out about the sex workers that had been murdered throughout the 90s and early 2000s in Glasgow. I had absolutely no idea until then just how many murders there had been, and I definitely had no idea just how much information there was out there about each of the murder victims and their cases. So please join me next time to find out more about a further 4 sex workers who were murdered in Glasgow and whether any of the murder victims received justice.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.